Ended today an annual homeless memorial at Trinity Church, not far from here, just next to the Eaton Center. We stood under a rain-spattered sky and listened to the names of the dead, of people, homeless people who have died in Toronto in the past year, as people held candles. And there was a moment of silence. There were poems and people spoke. Tomorrow's Remembrance Day, but it seemed to me that the homeless dead that we remember today are the truly forgotten, and I'm just so glad and so proud that we're able to have two prominent anti-poverty activists here to talk about the work that they do with artists and to help all of us who are in the arts or the creative industries think about how to remember in a more ethical and inclusive and creative way. I also want to introduce someone who's going to say a few words, someone who's been a true friend of the studio through thick and thin, and who really does understand the power of bringing together activism, media, and scholarship. Charles Falzon, who's just been appointed Dean of the Faculty of Communication and Design. Please welcome Charles.
I won't keep you. I just wanted to really point out how important this work is, and to the work that everybody does, but of the Studio for Media Activism and Critical Thought in particular. I wanted to congratulate Mauricia and Amy for building this and for having the series and for bringing such distinguished speakers here today to help share stories. You are the Studio for Media Activism, for Critical Thought, for coming here and being part of it. The world needs change, and the best way to change the world is through our stories and our messaging and our work. And the themes that we're going to hear about tonight, like accountability and co-creation, they're at the heart of what it means to be in media and creative industries and to actually push the envelope of what is acceptable in the world and actually make things happen through activism. So I encourage you to continue supporting it, and I thank our guest speakers for coming here tonight, and I look forward to many more of these sessions. So thank you.
Hello, everybody. I have the pleasure of introducing our two speakers tonight. The first, Cathy Crowe, is a social activist, educator, and street nurse. She's an advocate for the homeless and has worked on issues affecting the homeless, such as shelter conditions and inadequate housing, for over 2 decades. In 1998, Crowe co-founded the Toronto Disaster Relief Committee, which declared homelessness a national disaster. Cathy is a distinguished visiting practitioner here at Ryerson. The second speaker is a longtime friend of mine, Dr. Alex Abramovich, who is a nationally recognized leader in the area of LGBTQ youth homelessness and is one of the few Canadian researchers studying the phenomenon of queer and trans youth homelessness. Alex is currently working at the Centre for Addiction and Mental Health in the Community-Based Research Postdoctoral Fellowship Program. I also just wanted to let you know that the students that are part of the Social Justice Media course tonight are blogging the event and have blogged past events as well. And you can find their writing at the studioformediaactivism.com under the blogs. And we encourage you to check that out. It's another way that students engage with the speakers and ideas that are part of this course. So without further ado, I would like to welcome Cathy and Alex.
Okay, so we're just going to start off with a little Q&A between ourselves over here, and we just ask that if you have any questions, just if you could please just hold your questions to the end. After our short little introduction Q&A over here, Cathy will provide you with a more formal presentation, and then I'll have a more formal presentation as well, and then we'll do a group activity, and we'll have some time for Q&A. Hi, Cathy.
Hi.
So Cathy, how did you first get involved in utilizing art in your work as a street nurse?
So that was fun to think about because I realized that until I was 30, maybe I hadn't even gone to an art gallery, which is pretty shocking, I think. So what happened for me was many years ago, an artist named Deborah Waddington approached me and asked me to be part of an exhibit she was curating, and it was called something like Power of the Nurse Heart, or Power of the Heart, and she interviewed nurses, and then she made us, because we didn't really want to do it, she made us create a piece of art based on what we were saying, and that effort made me kind of pour out of my heart the things I was seeing every day that I still see, like homeless deaths and the diminishment of nursing in organizations and the advocacy that was needed. And at the center of my picture was a huge fist, because I was hopeful and, you know, trying to figure out how to fight back. So that's kind of how I think it began as a process for me. So what about you? How did you get involved in this work? I know a little bit from the newspapers, from when I first heard about you, but how did it start for you?
So I grew up in Toronto, and having grown up in Toronto, the issue of homelessness, I think, is so visible to us in so many ways. So I remember as a child being really interested and just really wanting to understand how is it that I have a home and some people don't have a home. And so that's, if I think back to when I was a child, I remember feeling very strongly about wanting to understand more about homelessness. And then in my early 20s, long before I came out as a trans man, I originally came out as a lesbian, and I had a really, really challenging coming out experience. And so there was a lot of rejection and not a lot of support. And it was really through that experience that I came to understand how easy it is to become homeless. And I think before that, I thought that it's really hard to become homeless, like that wouldn't happen to me or to anyone that I know. So I think that made it very real, and I understood that it's actually quite easy, especially if you're a young queer or trans person coming out to an unsupportive family, which happens so often. So that's really where that journey sort of started for me. And I feel very grateful that I've been able to use my own personal experience to help those who are in similar and worse circumstances. And I really see that as creating a prevention plan and hopefully leading, to a world where nobody has to know what it feels like to not have a home simply for being attracted to or loving another person, or even just for being ourselves in a world that really forces us to be like everyone else, right? Yeah. All right, Cathy, so you're usually described as an advocate on homelessness and for affordable housing. Has media or art making influenced your activism?
A lot. I often tell people I could not have done it without mainstream media, alternative media, but what's been really inspiring is the cultural and art component of the kind of media activism we're going to talk about tonight. I've been a street nurse for 27 years, so through really, really dark times, lots of homeless deaths. I wasn't at the memorial today, but man, we've been doing that every month for decades. And it's been absolutely life-saving for me, I think, to have that connection to art and media activism in that way. Some people listen to me, other people don't listen to me, so it's been a way of opening doors to spread the message to other communities. And I'm going to show some pictures about that in a few minutes. So first of all, I just have to insert here that one of my dreams has been to bring Alex to Ryerson. So thanks for doing this, because I didn't have to do any work except hang out with them to plan this. So you're an activist and a researcher. Is that possible? How do you do that?
That's a good question. So I've been thinking about that a lot lately, and just about my identity as an activist, as a researcher, academic. And I really resisted calling myself an activist for many years. And it really wasn't until I actually became an academic, became a researcher, that it felt really important to then identify as an activist as well. And I think that the reason for that is because my research is my activism, right? And my activism is my research, and you really can't separate the two. They come together. And so I think that people often have this idea that you're either an activist or you're a researcher. It doesn't really work together, especially if you're working in a more traditional academic environment. But there are different types of research methodologies that we can use as researchers, such as community-based research that really value activism and working with communities and fighting for social change. So I think that there are more of us out there than people know about. Good, excellent. Yeah. So Cathy, have there been any surprises or challenges along the way for you in your work?
For sure. Oh, sorry. For sure. The one time I got involved in, okay, I have to give you the backstory. So Adam Vaughan, who was then a CBC reporter, once said to me, and he has a very direct way of speaking. He said to me, Cathy, the politicians are not going to do anything about homelessness until a child dies. And so I went through a period of being absolutely devastated by that comment and frustrated and mad. I went through the whole thing. Then I decided to make a film about it. So with a filmmaker, Laura Skye, I made 3 films. So what was pretty shocking then was the difficulty we faced raising money for the film and the resistance we met in really rich cities like Calgary, who said, we don't need a family shelter here for homeless families with children. And so I didn't anticipate that. So that was like a big shocker. And then I think other shockers along the way were the silencing that happened of myself as an activist. So it's great to hear you link academia and activism, because I've tried to do that with nursing, but it for many years became a dirty word, right? So I'm still pretty shocked by that, and some people have been blacklisted, literally, as a result of that. So that's been a surprise and challenge. So how have you incorporated art in your activism? And I'm sure we're going to see some images in your presentation. Can you give us a little summary of that?
Yeah, for sure. So the way that I incorporate art, I'm going to talk about my research because that's my activism, right? So it's really through exploring different types of research methodologies, so arts-informed research and film-based methods. And so for myself, using film in my research has been the greatest way that I've incorporated art into my work. And so a great example is a research study that I'm currently wrapping up. And this is it uses a broker dialogue method. And broker dialogue is a qualitative research method, which is a participatory film-based method. And I'm working with a filmmaker on this project, and Amy Siegel, who's here. And so we've been working closely together on several different projects, but on this particular project, so this project looks at LGBTQ youth homelessness and access to mental health services. So there were 6 key informants that took part. So there was 3 young people with lived experience, 1 child and youth psychiatrist, the Toronto City Councillor, and the general manager of shelter operations with the City of Toronto. And so the participants never actually met face-to-face, but rather through film. So we would share film clips back and forth, and that helped facilitate respectful dialogue on an issue that they wouldn't normally discuss. And so the final deliverable of this project is not just a formal research report, but also a 30-minute film that could be shared more widely.
Including maybe at Ryerson someday?
Yeah, sure.
So I'm going to talk very specifically around media activism and homelessness. This is a picture of a straw bale house outside of the Federal, Provincial, Territorial Housing Ministers meeting that happened in Gatineau. And it's really to just highlight the fact that over the years, I think art has been incorporated a fair bit in some of the anti-poverty and homeless housing advocacy and activism in the country. And in this particular case, very much influenced by Frapru, which is a very mobile, engaged, active community that's musical and loud and very artistic. And again, through lots of demonstrations in all walks of life, but including in homelessness and housing advocacy, art has been incorporated. So the picture on the left is a square from a quilt that was developed by folks working with homeless women in particular from drop-in centers and shelters, and it was eventually used in protest at both Queen's Park, but also this was part of a display in Nathan Phillips Square at City Hall. And so I'm going to talk very specifically around media activism and homelessness. This is a picture of a straw bale house outside of the Federal, Provincial, Territorial Housing Ministers meeting that happened in Gatineau. And it's really to just highlight the fact that over the years, I think art has been incorporated a fair bit in some of the anti-poverty and homeless housing advocacy and activism in the country. And in this particular case, very much influenced by Frepru, which is a very mobile, engaged, active community that's musical and loud and very artistic. And again, through lots of demonstrations in all walks of life, but including in homelessness and housing advocacy, art has been incorporated. So the picture on the left is a square from a quilt that was developed by folks working with homeless women in particular from drop-in centers and shelters, and it was eventually used in protest at both Queen's Park, but also this was part of a display in Nathan Phillips Square at City Hall. And on the right, this was very imaginary, like just grassroots artwork done in drop-ins and shelters where the names of people who had died while they were homeless were put on signs, and then this was an anti-war protest that had a link to housing. So the signs were posted all over the military hardware that was there outside of the Moss Park Arena. And we picked the Moss Park Arena because it's a downtown military site, but also because in the past we had used it as emergency shelter when the mayor had opened it up for shelter. It's interesting to note that if you walk by that corner now at Jarvis and Queen, there's a huge fence around Moss Park Armory now, and I think that's why. This is a more purposeful art creation by a pretty well-known artist in Toronto called Devon Ostrom, and he curated this exhibit that was done by about 10 graffiti artists down on the waterfront at the original Tent City location by the silo down at the waterfront near Cherry and the highway. So this was done in connection with Streetscape with the ROM, the Royal Ontario Museum, and Luminato. And I have to say that, artists are busy and, lots of glitches happen. And in this particular case, all of the people that had lived at Tent City and all of us that were activists around Tent City didn't know this was happening. And I can actually see this site from my window, but we never knew it was happening till after the fact. So that was a learning experience, and Devon learned from that and ultimately involved us in many other ways, so that it led to this installation at the ROM, if you can imagine. It was very, very powerful. People who had lived at Tent City, which was a massive waterfront encampment of close to 140 people, they got to come, they got to take part. The section on Nancy, who lived at Tent City, that's in a book I'll tell you about later, was up on the wall, the whole story. And again, a few glitches in the sense that an additional video was there where people could just see it, but it was a video that had a lot of stereotypes in it, shall I say. So the ups and downs, and I think it was a function of probably this was put together on a really tight deadline, and there probably wasn't a lot of funding for community development, so some mistakes were made, but otherwise pretty impressive. Photography. Photography is in many ways probably one of the most judgmental tools that's used to depict homeless people, right? And many other oppressed groups, you could say. In this case, I'm going to show you a series of photographs by David Barker Maltby. David was a photographer but also an activist. His photos often appeared in Now magazine, accompanied with stories. He was a friend, and I was involved with him in other activism, and he would periodically touch base with me. So having that relationship of touching base and saying, you know, Cathy, what's happening? Anything new that's developing that you want to tell me about? Because there's always something. So for any of you that are journalists in the room, having that connection with a person or groups is really, really important. So in this case, he was almost embedded at Tent City. He didn't live and sleep overnight all the time at Tent City, but he spent a lot of time there. He was totally trusted by the community, and I think his pictures really reflect it. That's when it was still Tent City in a tent. That's Dry in a tent. This is Nancy Baker, again, a very positive, glowing image of her with one of the dogs that lived there. This is Marty and April. You know, I won't try to describe how I see the picture, but of significance here is the 1% button that Marty is wearing. That was our campaign for 1% of the budget to go back into affordable housing. There's just a lot of dignity in these pictures. This is Dry examining the site of a fire that had happened to one of the shacks down at Tent City. This is Nancy and Dwayne showing where they actually physically lived. This is before all the houses and the prefab houses came in. Marty again, that one of the silos is still standing, and I'm going to show you a video of it in a few minutes. He's bringing in wood here, so it's showing him how people actually surviving. Brian and Karen, a couple that lived in this under this tarpaulin. They were eventually the inhabitants of one of the first prefab houses we brought in, and that's their dog Chaos, which was aptly named for the community, I think. And then Rooster Squat. Rooster Squat was a squat right in the silo of primarily youth, some LGBT youth and trans that lived in the squat before Tent City. Olivia Child describes Rooster Squat in her book, as does Jack Layton. We all spent a lot of time there. Absolutely PCB-laden water and soil, and a nightmare of a place. But, you know, this image, and again, none of these images are showing people down on the ground, lying flat on a grate, stoned, you know. It's showing other aspects of people's lives. And this is one of my favorites. This is David capturing David in a way, because that's what journalists were doing down there. So this was on the day that, I don't know, we were delivering turkey dinner or probably at the prefab house. But it's showing with fun that Tent City also became a spectacle because they never had privacy. Media were down there all the time, although that's in part how they got saved when the eviction happened. So then I wanted to mention film as another category of ways I've been able to work with people. In my opinion, the best film made on homelessness in Canada is Shelter from the Storm. You can watch it online. If you don't have time to write down that link, just Google Shelter from the Storm plus hot dogs. It's on their website. These are some of the images from the film. It totally showed the beginning of Tent City, the progression of activism among the homeless people down there. It showed a traveling to Quebec City to win an affordable housing agreement with the feds, which absolutely did not turn into a national housing program. It showed people as articulate, well-spoken, really made a big impact in the country, and ultimately won a housing program for those people when they were evicted. So that totally made a difference. Another filmmaker named Shelley Saywell made a film called Street Nurse, about me, but about the issues. But both Shelley Saywell and Michael Connolly, both when we asked them to, would step up and do other filming things. So in this case, they helped document the inhumane shelter conditions in city-funded shelters. So that's actual footage in and out of the cold program, where people, and you could still see a scene like that today. 29 years that the city of Toronto is now relying on faith-based organizations to sleep people one night at a time in different church basements. So this footage, and this image here is from film footage from the film Straighteners that was done actually without my permission or approval, but when we saw it, it was so profound that we had to release it to the media with special considerations such as hiding the face of the individuals, not naming the shelter. Still to this day, I don't name the shelter that is, but that violated the United Nations standard for refugee camps. 160 people sleeping in a basement, maybe the size of this room, lights on the entire night so that people wouldn't trip over each other, no showers, lots of coughing. You can actually hear the illness in the room. So again, this was a really unique example of trust and of filmmakers who were activists stepping up and contributing to our efforts. And then you might have seen this image if you're a Ryerson student for 2 years in a row. Something called In the Air Tonight happens. When I first came to Ryerson, the first people to approach me were 2 PhD students that were in the program, the joint program, Ryerson and I think it's York. It wasn't nursing, it wasn't social work, it wasn't any of the other obvious faculties, it was these 2 students. And they created a project that the university approved where for 1 month, it's the month of January, if you tweet #homelessness, the building goes from blue to red, and it's all tied in with wind technology as well. So I was a little skeptical at first when I got involved with this project. It wasn't something I normally take part in, but it was pretty inspiring. And these guys were inspiring, Dave Colangelo and Patricio Davila. And they were inspired by a Chilean artist named Alfredo Yar. He did a project in Montreal called Lights in the City that involved homeless people pressing buttons that changed lighting on a building there. And I'm just going to quote you one thing that Dave wrote. As creators of large-scale visual art installations that seek to deepen our connections to matters of public concern, we're attempting to address these questions in a way that we hope will increase our collective understanding of the issue of homelessness and evoke change. So it's hard to measure the change that happened, but for sure they reached a whole audience that we had never, ever connected with. Organizations and blogs and websites, that was just incredible. And this is like one image, don't try to read it, but this is an image from a blog that kind of described these wild ideas that they were doing. And they were trying to harness people's energy, and for a period of time, the #homelessness increased like 10% in the world based on this. For sure, we were able to use it both after homeless people froze to death in the city and after some other incidents to garner other approaches and advocacy to city councilors. So that was pretty interesting. And it got announced every night on CP24 apparently, and so it was pretty cool. So then, these same guys, Dave Colangelo and Patricio Davila, they decided they wanted to do something a step up. So using this map that was drawn by Marty of Tent City, and these are all images from my book, they decided to do a creation, an art installation down on the waterfront. Now, how's my time? Have I got 10 minutes to show this video, do you think? Yep, okay. So down on the waterfront, again, where Tent City, there's a lot of linkages here. So down on the waterfront where Tent City was, before the eviction, 140 people lived there and like 15 dogs, and there were over 50 shacks and houses. Nobody was in a tent any longer. There was a place of worship, and it was just incredible. And then it was, the community was brutally evicted while Mel Lastman was the mayor, and the eviction was by Home Depot. So this one silo still exists. I'm going to show you now what they did. The original creation is way more interesting because it has cycles and bicycles and all kinds of things. But there's something called Art Spit in the city where hundreds of people on bicycles do a tour. And all of them landed here at Tent City for this one event. So again, it was reaching a lot of people. So I'll let you watch and listen.
Before I moved to Tent City, I'd been living in a rooming house. After I paid my rent, I had $70 a month to live on. There was no sense locking my door, because if you pushed on any door, it would just open. There was no safety factor. So my friend Nancy finally talked me into moving to Tent City. She'd been there for more than a year. I knew 6 or 7 of the other people there, and I felt extremely comfortable. We started off in an abandoned old Volkswagen van that was up on blocks and had no floor, except for the one we built. The first winter, we wrapped ourselves in sleeping bags to stay warm. We had so many of them piled on us that we couldn't turn over sometimes from the wind. Wild animals would come up and get into our food, especially the groundhogs. There were 2 foxes there at the beginning and 2 coyotes. If you were up very early, that's when you'd see them. They were pretty skittish. If we were slow getting up, ducks would come quacking at our door. We'd feed them stale bread. Because there were so few of us there, there wasn't a rat problem. The rats came later. We had our first pregnancy that winter, because the nearest payphone was 20 minutes away down at Cherry Beach restaurant. A nurse gave me some computer printouts and a 2-hour crash course on how to deliver a baby. Those were the pre-outhouse days, when we used a human litter box behind a dumpster. We took turns hauling in fresh dirt. We were about 18 people then, and we were all living in tents and lean-tos made with tarps
So to be there that night, though, was quite powerful to see like 200 cyclists, like of, you know, mostly young people coming in, and it was just very still while people were listening to this. The actual, if you can see the actual original Maggie Chan film that's on Vimeo, if you Google Tent Cities plus Art Spin, because it's really very creative and it's worth seeing. So I'm just going to end there, but to say that I do have some of my books for sale here. That story is from my book. My book is all the individual oral stories of people that I've worked with over the years that were activists. And welcome Alex onto the stage next.
All right. So first of all, I just want to thank you for having me here with you this evening. This is very exciting for me because I'm such a huge fan of Cathy's, and I have been following Cathy's work for a long time, and so it's a real honor to co-present with you, Cathy. So thank you for this opportunity. Okay, so I'm going to deliver a presentation to you over the next 25 minutes, and then I have a 6-minute film that I'm going to share as well. So I'm going to start off with some background information on LGBTQ youth homelessness, for those of you who might be a little less familiar with the issue, and also just to provide some context. And I'm going to be using the acronym LGBTQ and LGBTQ2S, and I'll also say queer and trans, and I'm going to use those all interchangeably. But I think it's important to acknowledge that the acronym LGBTQ doesn't necessarily encompass all of the different ways that people identify, and people identify in so many different ways. But for the purpose of this talk, I'm going to say LGBTQ. And then I'm going to speak a little bit about what it means to be an activist immersed in community, as well as a scholar and a researcher working in a more traditional academic environment, and how I've been able to combine these two very important identities. And I'm also going to, as I said, share a short digital storytelling film, and I'll talk a little bit about film-based methods and my research with communities and how that has actually led to change. And I'm going to use my PhD research as an example. All right, so I'm going to start off with a little bit of background information. And I apologize if this is old information for some of you, but I do think that it's important that we start off by highlighting the problem first before we talk about the solutions. So LGBTQ youth homelessness in Canada is certainly not a new issue, even though it has recently received quite a bit of attention. We've actually known about this problem for a long time. So we've known about this problem for over 20 years now. And we've also known for a long time that LGBT youth are overrepresented in the homeless youth population, but underrepresented in shelters. And unfortunately, it's taken a really long time for this issue to enter dialogue on youth homelessness. So we've only actually recently started to engage in serious discussion about this problem on a national level. However, still there is minimal support available to queer and trans youth in many parts of the country, and still shelters and housing programs are oftentimes actually very dangerous places for queer and trans youth, and this is due to homophobic and transphobic violence that occurs. Research on queer and trans youth homelessness has definitely expanded in recent years, but there's minimal investigation into these issues. So we also don't have large-scale data collection. So we tend to rely on the statistic 25 to 40%. So we say that 25 to 40% of homeless youth in Canada identify as LGBTQ, but it's important to note that this is a statistic that came from a study about 16 years ago. So we rely on old data when we talk about this problem. And the reason that we do that is because there's been quite a bit of difficulty with regards to scaling the problem of queer and trans youth homelessness, both nationally and also provincially. And this is because services often don't actually collect data with regards to people's gender and sexual identities. And this is why we rely on old data, because we just don't have the data. And also hidden homelessness, which Cathy spoke about a bit, is a major concern for this population of young people. So that makes measurement even more difficult. And then when we look at the needs and the risks of the population, we know that LGBT youth face increased risk of physical and sexual exploitation, mental health difficulties, substance use, and suicide. We also know that trans youth, especially trans women of color, are often the most underrepresented group of people in the shelter system and in housing programs, but the most discriminated against group of people, because not only are they dealing with transphobia, but also racism and oftentimes homophobia as well. So this issue of intersecting oppressions is a very real concern for this population of young people, and we can't ignore the issue of intersecting oppressions. Trans and gender non-conforming youth are often rejected by shelters and are often not permitted to access the shelter that matches with the gender with which they identify. And this is because shelter workers often don't receive training and just don't know how to deal with what to do when a trans person comes to the door. So they tend to actually really struggle most when it comes to access for trans people in shelters. Unfortunately, a high proportion of LGBT youth, homeless youth, feel safer on the streets than in shelters. And this is due, once again, to homophobic and transphobic violence that occurs in shelters and in housing programs. And although LGBTQ youth often avoid shelters and avoid housing programs, and they may describe the streets as being a safer option in certain circumstances, I think it's very important to emphasize that sleeping outside, sleeping on the streets is not safe. It's not safe for anyone, and it's especially not safe for this population of young people. And this is going to be an important point for us to think about as we move forward with when we have our group activity and our group discussion. We're going to be talking about sleeping on the streets. So when we talk about queer and trans youth sleeping rough, we know that they are especially at high risk for violence and discrimination. And I've heard young people talk about how they stay awake all night to increase their safety. So I'm going to read you a quote from a young trans man who I interviewed, who spoke about how he avoided shelters due to transphobia and how he slept outside because the shelter system just wasn't safe. Nothing's really safe. That's the biggest issue. There's no such thing as safe. You just got to have your wits about you. You sleep during the day and you're walking around all night. Your daytime is your safe time because there are more people around. So although we know this, although we've had this knowledge for over 20 years now, still there are no emergency shelters in Canada for this population of young people. So we still don't have any emergency shelters for queer or trans youth. So earlier, during when Cathy and I had our little Q&A, I spoke about the Broker Dialogue project that I'm working with Amy on. And this project focuses on LGBTQ youth homelessness and access to mental health services. And as I mentioned, this project brought together 6 key participants who wouldn't normally engage in dialogue on this issue. And so the participants never met in person, but we shared film clips back and forth. And this really opened up the possibility of respectful and meaningful exchange on this issue. And the study revealed that we have a system that deals with shelters, we have a system that deals with shelters and housing services, and we also have a mental health system. So we have these 2 separate systems that rarely actually work together. So I'm going to read you a quote from a young person who participated in the study, and he said, "I was in the shelter system for a long time. I was displaying clear signs of mental health issues, and never did the staff ask me if I was okay. Never did they bring me to a doctor or a support group. Never did anyone do anything like that. Maybe it's because I didn't stay in one place for long enough. But when you see someone who's exhibiting serious symptoms of an illness, like the flu or a simple illness, you get them help. But when you see someone who's experiencing mental health issues, you throw them out. That's what they did to me." So when I first started doing this work, almost 10 years ago, there was very little discussion happening with regards to this issue. And during that time, I was told over and over again that this actually is not an issue. This is not a problem in Toronto. This is not a problem in Toronto's shelter system. But still, I continuously tried to meet with just about anyone who would talk to me at the City of Toronto. So for me, it was actually really important to try to collaborate with the city because I wanted my research to lead to policy change. So I wanted to see concrete changes in policies, in rules, and in shelter standards. I was eventually told that there just wasn't enough evidence with regards to the situation of LGBT youth homelessness in Toronto, and that they needed more evidence to be convinced to take action and to be convinced that this is actually a problem. So that is actually what prompted me to do my PhD. And I feel incredibly grateful that I was in a position where that was a possibility for me. And I realized that for a lot of people, that might not even be an option. So I'm very grateful that I was able to do that. So going into my PhD, I already knew that there was minimal support. So that wasn't something that I needed to discover. That was something that I was very aware of. I knew that there wasn't a whole lot of support available to queer and trans youth experiencing homelessness. But I wanted to know more about what happens when a young queer or trans person enters the shelter system. I wanted to hear about those stories and those experiences. And I also wanted to find creative ways to be able to share those stories with the world and hope that that could actually lead to change. So I knew that I had to be strategic and I had to find the right tools that could assist in raising awareness. And essentially, I had to find the right tools that would convince people that this is a serious issue. But I also needed to find tools that wouldn't only convince people that it's an issue, but also that would allow me to engage with the community as well in a productive way. So my main methodological framework was critical action research, and the study was also informed by elements of critical ethnography and institutional ethnography. But I'm not going to bore you with the details of the methodology. I'm just going to say a few things about critical action research. So some of the primary principles of critical action research were that this particular research study really focused on responding to local concerns and producing practical knowledge that could be useful to local communities and organizations. And that was really important for me in my work. So working within this particular framework really helped ensure that my research reached beyond the academy and into the real world where it could have the potential to have real world change. So knowledge translation has been an integral part of my research, and I've worked very hard to find ways to move my work from text to action. I really did not want my research to be a sort of formal research report just sitting on a shelf. I wanted it to be something that could really enter the world and that people who are affected most by these problems could actually really engage with the work. So in preparation for this talk today, I've been thinking a lot about, one, how I engage with communities in my research, and two, what my knowledge translation process actually looks like. So essentially, how do I move my research from text to action, which I'm just going to refer to as the KT process from this point onwards. And really for me, the two actually come hand in hand. So there's no action without community. We need to engage community in order to create action. And to be honest with you, when I was doing this work, when I was involved in my PhD, I didn't necessarily sit down and think through a formal KT process, but for me it was something that I actually really just naturally fell into. So I've outlined here my KT process, and I've thought about what are the most important lessons that I learned and that I took away from this work. And so here are the 5 most important tools that could really describe my KT approach and that could describe how my research actually turned into action. So first and foremost, engaging and involving the communities that are affected most by the issues, that was most important to me. And so this involved, obviously, involving young LGBT people who are experiencing homelessness or have experienced homelessness in the past. In addition to engaging the communities that are affected by the problems, I also worked with artists and filmmakers in particular. And so, as I said, I've done a lot of work with Amy. And so my approach to knowledge creation could really be characterized as a collaborative effort between the participants, the filmmaker, and the researcher, if there's a filmmaker involved in the particular project. And I think that in our culture, only certain people are actually granted the privilege of being acknowledged as knowledge producers. And so when we think about research involving people experiencing homelessness are often viewed as the subjects in research. And they're rarely actually given any credit for being the knowers or for being the experts of their own experiences. So a major aim for my work was really to begin to shift away from that traditional knowledge production and to start to engage the community and to really recognize LGBTQ youth experiencing homelessness as knowledge producers who are the experts of their own experiences. So therefore, this meant that I had to spend a lot of time building rapport and building trust with the communities that were involved in the work, which I think is key, and I think that should be key for for any type of research project. And with regards to collaborating with a filmmaker, I think that for a lot of researchers, this could be tricky, and I think that actually really any artistic collaboration could be complicated. I think that it means finding a right match, so really finding somebody who you could work with creatively. And I feel very lucky in this regard, but I think that it could certainly be difficult, and I think that sometimes it takes time to find the right person, and I think that working with a filmmaker who understands research, who's a researcher as well, that obviously is very helpful. So the second step involves engaging with key stakeholders. So for myself, I continuously try to engage in dialogue with key stakeholders in the area of youth homelessness. And this meant really getting to know the system in a different way, understanding the rules and the policies of the system, and of course, knowing who the key players are. And I would say that for myself, this was the most complicated aspect of my KT efforts, and probably of my research, actually, because the key stakeholders didn't want to talk to me. So they didn't necessarily want to discuss these issues, and they didn't want to speak to me. So I dealt with a great deal of resistance, not just from the key stakeholders, but also from the shelter system. And for me, that was really difficult because I needed the shelters to participate in my research, but they didn't want to participate. So this forced me to really modify my approach and to take an extra step and to make sure that key stakeholders and shelters knew that I was actually operating from a position of wanting to work with them rather than wanting to work against them. And I think that that was the problem. I think that that's how I was perceived. I think I was perceived as a young, angry activist who was trying to take down the system. And so for me, it was about trying to make them understand that I wanted to collaborate with them. So as I said, there was a real lack of dialogue and a real lack of interest in this area over the years. So when I first started doing this work, it was fundamental for me to engage with social media, because if the key stakeholders and the shelters, and there were so few people that wanted to speak to me, so I turned to social media, and I decided to create groups and forums on just about all of the major social media networks. And this also included creating a podcast on youth homelessness, a blog, and a website. And at first, there was really just a few members that were part of these groups. And then eventually the numbers started to grow. And before I knew it, these were really large groups. And there was actually national dialogue on LGBTQ youth homelessness that was happening online. So that was pretty amazing. And I think in addition, so these tools that we can create that we can use to open up dialogue can also be used to actually measure and evaluate the impact that the dialogue is having. So a lot of these tools could be used to track who's engaging in dialogue, how far is the dialogue reaching, how frequently are people talking about these problems, what type of dialogue. So that also was very helpful for my research. So the fourth step was just recognizing that there are so many different tools, and that the different tools are going to reach different audiences, obviously. So I think it's important to figure out which tools are going to most effectively deliver your message, depending on who you're speaking to. So I think it's important to figure out which tools work for you as a researcher or as an activist. And I think one of the defining elements of arts-informed research is that research is form. So really trying to understand what form works for you, because the form that we choose is what guides our work. So whether that be film or photography. And for myself, I discovered that film-based methods are an extremely effective tool in helping people understand certain complex issues. And I think that people are generally impacted by the power of film. So this is why film has been a key component in the work that I've done, and it has also been a key component in moving the research into action. So the last step of the KT approach was really just that I never accepted no as an answer, even though it was the only answer that I received for the first few years of doing this work. But I think that being really, really committed to this work and just wanting to have an impact, and knowing what my goals were, that obviously helped out a lot. And collaborating with communities and with filmmakers has been such a critical component as well, because I wasn't alone, and I was able to build a sort of community of research and of activism. I also had to build partnerships and collaborations even when it was impossible, like I said, when nobody would speak to me. So that took a lot of effort, and it was extremely time consuming, and I think that this could be one of the most time consuming steps of the KT approach. But I think that if you have a team, or even if you're working with one other person, this could be more manageable. So for the remainder of my presentation, I want to talk a little bit about film-based methods and about how I've incorporated digital storytelling in particular in my research. So I'm wondering how many of you know what digital storytelling is? Okay, so quite a few people. Okay, so I'll just quickly go over this. Basically, digital storytelling is a combination of text, pictures, graphics, videos, and voice, normally to create a 2 to 8 minute film, first-person narrative used for research, for activism, for community development, policy change. And digital stories tend to revolve around a chosen theme and often a particular viewpoint. I like to think of digital storytelling as bringing social media and first-hand experience together to educate and inform the public. And I think that digital storytelling, what it does really well is that it bridges communities, and it also bridges communities and researchers, communities and policymakers, and I've seen just how powerfully this can happen firsthand. So for myself, I've chosen to use digital storytelling as a tool for many reasons, but I think most importantly, I've chosen to use digital storytelling is because it really honors the lives of community members as knowledge, and as a form of knowledge creation, which was such an important component of my work. It also has the power to make research and complex ideas more accessible to the world and to multiple audiences. And I think that digital storytelling really opens up the mind and the heart in such an effective way, in such a way that is so different than reading a formal research report. So one of the stages of my PhD included a digital storytelling project, in which I worked with a young trans woman named Teal, and I also collaborated with a community artist, and we created a 6-minute short film that shared Teal's experience of what it was like for her as a trans woman to navigate Toronto's shelter system and to deal with daily transphobia and discrimination. And this was one of the first times that anyone had ever asked Teal to share her story, let alone to create a film about her story. So she described the experience as empowering. She said that it really validated her feelings and it made her feel seen, especially having come from a situation in the shelter system where she was continuously made to feel silenced and made to feel invisible. So we worked closely together on this project, and I did my best to try to make sure that it was as participatory as possible and that she was involved in all of the editing and in really every step of the way. Oops. So before I mentioned that the digital story was really the key component in moving my research from text to action. And so I had tried to meet with the city on numerous occasions, and finally we developed a small working group, and so I was finally invited to come in and to have a meeting, and I started off the meeting with Teal's story. And it was really interesting. After so many years of trying to engage in dialogue on these issues, I shared the film, and it was like the response I got was, okay, we understand that this is a problem now, so how do we fix it? So it's like, had I known, years before that I just needed to create that film. So that was pretty incredible. So obviously during data collection, when I was collecting data, when I was interviewing young people, when I was conducting focus groups in the shelter system, I was very aware of the power imbalances that existed between the youth participants in particular and myself. I was also mindful of the fact that some of the youth participants really, they viewed me as one of them, and that made it really easy, actually. But then others saw me as a researcher from a big institution who was trying to get a PhD, and therefore they actually felt really disconnected from me, and that didn't help out at all. So I thought a lot about how am I going to balance this imbalance, this power imbalance. And so I decided to create my own digital story and to create a 4-minute digital story about my own personal coming out experience, which was a traumatic experience, and to share that period of my life with the young people that I was working with. And I decided to do this because, first of all, I don't think that it's fair as a researcher to ask participants to do something that you yourself as a researcher aren't willing to do as well, or to ask questions that you aren't willing to answer. And I also wanted to make sure that I knew exactly what it was that I was asking the participants to create, because if I didn't go through that process, I wouldn't know what that process looked like. So to me, the decision to share my personal story also had a lot to do with community accountability and with my own sense of ethics. So going above and beyond what was required of me as an academic going through a formal research ethics board, I think was very important, because the Research Ethics Board doesn't require you to share your personal story with participants. But for me, that was important. So before I share the film, I'm just going to talk a little bit about, so I've outlined the KT process. And for me, one of the most important outcomes of the KT strategy, and of course using film in my research, has been that this research actually ended up getting a fair amount of media attention. And that was really great, because that actually helped raise awareness. So I think that helped people finally understand that this is a very serious problem in our city and in our country. The media attention also helped, was a key factor in getting some of the key recommendations that came out of the research into practice, off the ground and into practice. So there's been a great shift in people's understanding of these problems, and also people's willingness to discuss these problems with me. And I think that a very important lesson that I learned from this particular project was that those who have the power to make, or the authority to make changes, to make key decisions and changes, can actually be persuaded. And this is something that I really didn't believe when I first started doing this work. But now I understand that people can be persuaded, and that this type of research that uses film and visual media, I think, is key in helping people understand certain complex issues. So for example, Toronto is about to open its first transitional housing program for LGBTQ youth. And this is something that we've waited for a very long time, something that young people have been asking for a long time. So that is a very, very big next step. We also have new policies and new standards in Toronto with regards to LGBTQ youth homelessness. So that's a very big step as well. And not just in Ontario, but also across Canada, actually, government is starting to step in. So I think even though it's taken so many years, obviously, we're starting to see some significant changes. So when somebody tells me that that change isn't possible, or that it's just not worth it, it's just not going to happen, I obviously don't believe that. I think change is always possible. So I'm going to share Teal's story with you now. And I do want to just mention that, so it's a 6-minute film, but the situation, we created this film a couple of years ago, so the situation has actually changed quite a bit. So in the film, Teal speaks a lot about different organizations, and she specifically speaks about Covenant House and about her negative experience at Covenant House. So I just want to mention that Covenant House has changed their policies since we released this film publicly, and I think that probably helped out a lot. And so I think that the situation today at Covenant House is actually quite different than what you're going to see in the film.
I first moved to Toronto in 2004. I was so excited to be here. Everything was so big and new. If something ever happened anywhere, it happened here in Toronto too. Little did I know just how quickly I would get to explore the city. My father had kicked me out because he couldn't handle losing control of me, and I couldn't handle being his clone. I was scared at first, seeing the big shelter that is Covenant House and the people in front of it. Once there, I was angry. I wasn't like these people. I was better. I had plans and a life. I had skills and knowledge. I quickly learned those don't matter as much in the shelter. So I convinced myself all I had to do was bide my time and do what had to be done. I went to school, starting at College Station at 7 a.m. and going to Finch and Bathurst. Then I would ride all the way to Union and do 4 hours of telemarketing a night and arrive home maybe 10 or 10:30, eat my dinner, go to bed, and do the same over and over for 3 months. During this time, prom came about. This was most likely the best and worst time of my life. I'd come out, I bought a dress, my mother had sent me high heels, a show of both her acceptance of what I was doing and a lifesaver for me as I could not afford them. My friends destroyed me after that, some avoiding me outright, others mocking me, in person and online. What made it hardest was Covenant House. They refused to let me change on property. I was forced to change in a semi-hidden part of the subway station. After this, I moved into ROP, Rites of Passage, which was a connected housing program of Covenant House. They specifically use ID to place you on a gendered floor, whatever your ID says, regardless of how far you are in your transition. Imagine being a trans woman, with bottom surgery and all, placed on the male floor. This is also against the Toronto hostel standards. When I got there, they refused my name, forced me to wear gendered clothing, and fought with me every step of the way as I tried to fix these problems. Staff would tell me, and those I called from organizations to help me, to not bother, because nothing would change. They told me specifically that Covenant House was just too big to take on. Have you ever heard of a more perfect example of David and Goliath? But it wasn't all fighting the good fight. I put positive space stickers on my door. The first was cut in an X by a knife. Others were ripped, some slashed by keys. I called it the sticker death count, and it reached 16 before I finally left, at which point staff refused to take pictures of the damage. In my stay, I convinced them to respect chosen names and to no longer restrict clothing based on expected gender presentation. Many staff were not happy, both at me succeeding and at me proving them wrong. After RLP had found a way to get rid of me, I moved into Turning Point, an all-male shelter. This was who ROP decided to call or place me at. I wondered sometimes if it was on purpose. I detransitioned. I hid all my clothes away and went back to presenting as male. Despite Turning Point being in the Church and Wellesley area, the people living in there are known for being homophobic, and where there is homophobia, there is almost always transphobia. Through all this time, I had convinced myself I wasn't good enough to transition, and I had been unable to get a call back despite having a good resume that was checked over at an employment resource center, and I just seemed trapped. Then I moved into Eva's Phoenix. I lost more of my belongings as I moved into and out of this place. Every move in the shelter system was accompanied by the loss of my belongings, mainly due to the staff misplacing them in storage. Phoenix was not a bad place, but it was not a good place. I was met with tolerance far more than acceptance, and as such, I kept my transition slowed, wondering if I would ever be able to continue it. There were almost no personal supports there beyond a few friendly staff. I was expected to suck up my issues and find work. At this point, my confidence was just gone. I fell apart, I couldn't keep myself going, and I withdrew. I pushed my disconnect from everything further. I was so tired of fighting for everything and being hated all the time, I just couldn't handle it. However, I did take one stand. I put up a rainbow flag in my window, a window that faced the front of the building. This meant every person, funder, resident, visitor, or staff, had to look at my flag when they saw Main Street, which was laying between all houses in Phoenix. Some residents would later tell me that the flag helped them make a decision on whether to stay there or not, as almost all LGBTQ people going to shelters have a fear of them, because it isn't a matter of if it's dangerous, but just how dangerous it will be. It is horrible to live in that fear every day, and evidently, my need to give the support of the flag and to piss people off with its presence overpowered my fears. Well, that cost me. Not finding work meant I had to move into Turning Point, again. At this point, I completely gave up on my transition. There was no hope for me. I had no plan. I had attempted to get into school while I was in Phoenix and was rejected. I couldn't find work. I was useless. To avoid doing something stupid, I did what I call roboting. I disconnected to an extreme, to the point where my memories of that year are almost non-existent. It was all just a big blur of crappy experiences. Instead, I lived in a cyber cafe. The internet was safe. It had people in it, but provided me with the barrier I needed. I would sit there for up to 10 hours a day, budgeting what little money the shelters give you to make sure I could stay away from Turning Point by living in this one little safe space I had found. Eventually, YMCA Sprout House, a transitional housing program, called me at Turning Point to let me know that my application from Eva's Phoenix had come up. I hadn't even remembered making it, but sure enough, I was able to move. Almost a full year of living in Turning Point and I was free. I got into school. I improved all around. I found work. I went and continued my transition when I finally worked up the nerve to see a doctor, and I started talking to people again. I still have a lot of issues from my experience, but I'm better now. I finally got my own apartment back in January, and I'm working on fixing the years of damage and trying to find the good parts.
Yeah, so that's obviously a very powerful film, and it's no doubt that that helped create change, obviously, with in the shelter system. And that video is actually being used as a training tool in the shelter system, which is really great. Okay, so
You can put the lights up, I think, right?
yeah, that's we're just kind of like going,
We're going right now into an activity where, so Alex and I, have gotten to know each other kind of just recently, and one of the topics that really interests us is the portrayal of homeless people, and we wanted to show you some images now that we selected that I think will be very thought-provoking, and you'll have probably strong reactions to or comments on. A bit of a trigger warning on the first one, just to let you know there's an injection drug use image that we're going to show, just FYI. Hope that will be okay for folks.
Yeah.
Okay.
So that's this first campaign is an anti-panhandling campaign that took place in Calgary, Alberta. And you can see that they use taglines such as, "Your sympathy is killing me," "Your generosity is killing me," and they show people imprisoned by bars made of coins. They show change spilling from an alcohol bottle and someone shooting up with coins. And that's the same campaign, isn't it? Yeah.
These are very much worldwide phenomena. You can find these in pretty much every major city, wouldn't you say?
Yeah, absolutely. And yeah, so the whole point of these images that we're showing you is just to really highlight the different types of campaigns that are becoming more and more popular, that are supposed to be raising awareness to the issue of homelessness. And I don't think that these campaigns often actually include people with lived experience in the creation of them. So here's another anti-panhandling campaign. This is a different one. So this campaign is just sort of like a collage of the similar type of campaign, and it's a sleep out. How many of you are familiar with sleep out campaigns? Okay, so sleep out campaigns are becoming really quite popular, actually, and the whole purpose of a sleep out is an organization will have a sleep out where they'll encourage their staff members and people in the public to sleep outside, sleep on your deck, sleep in your backyard, in a parking lot, in a park. And the whole point is to hopefully raise awareness, raise some funds, and to not just to raise awareness, but also so that you yourself can understand then what it feels like to be homeless. So there's this thinking that if you sleep in your backyard, that you'll understand better of what it means to be homeless.
And they've been done on campus here, right? They're done everywhere. They're done across the street. The first one I ever saw was an annual Covenant House event where the chief of police would sleep with other prominent business people, and that kind of thing continues on to this day. There are other types of sleep out campaigns, though, I should mention, where, for example, I don't know if I've told you this, every Friday night for like 3 years, U of T students, a very small number of them slept out in Allen Gardens every Friday night, regardless of the weather, but that was for the advocacy purpose of calling for more emergency shelters. And then they were ultimately arrested. And the real beauty of it was when they won their court case, they won something like $25,000. They distributed it to 3 kind of activist-based groups to carry on the fight.
Mm-hmm. And what's interesting is that oftentimes these campaigns will have people that look very happy. They look really happy sleeping outside, and I personally find that quite interesting. And then some of the taglines they have also include, executive leaders sleep out for a night so that youth don't have to. But I still don't really understand how that works.
Yeah, they're still out there, aren't they? Yeah.
Yeah. Oh, sorry.
Okay.
Okay, so then here is the last campaign that we're going to share with you, and that took place in Toronto, right? And that is called Hobo Cop, is the name of the campaign. And do you want to talk about it?
Sure. So this is Officer, is this working? This is Officer Martelli, and he's going up to cars and people and saying, if you're on your cell phone right now, you're about to get a ticket. So he's disguising himself as a typical, so-called typical homeless guy. A lot of ethics around that with the police force. I'm pretty sure he got chastised for doing that. Even when police commit much more serious crimes, hardly anything happens. There's a big story in the paper about that today. So again, this is like perpetuating a certain stereotype, and we just wanted to show that there are many, many images and YouTube videos. There are so many that show somebody portraying that they're homeless, including even a child. There was a much longer video we were going to show you of a child dressing up, pretending they're homeless, to see reactions to people on the street. And it's just so mainstream now, it almost doesn't seem to shock people that it's happening. So we wanted to throw out a couple questions to you folks,
yes,
just
exactly.
to get some discussion going.
So these are 3 questions that we came up with, and we're not going to split you off actually into groups. So we're just asking that, we're just going to take a few moments, if you could speak to maybe just, I don't know, 3 or 4 people close by and answer these questions, and then we'll open it up for a larger group discussion, and we'll talk about these questions in relation to these campaigns.
Okay, folks, we're really open to just some of your thoughts. You don't have to go in order. Just some of your reactions to the images you saw. Do you think they work, don't work?
Yeah.
And then we can jump into other questions about our presentations too. Go ahead.
So we'll ask that you use the mics just so that
Oh, okay.
Okay.
We were just talking about how it's like very indicative of this like single story that is picked up by mainstream media a lot, and it's just like portraying this major narrative like all homeless people on the street are all like, they all use all of the money to go and get alcohol and go and shoot up, when that's not like indicative of everyone's like experience of like how they were homeless and what their experience is living on the streets. So it's just like very like offensive. Like, yeah, we were all talking about how it's super offensive and how like we don't really know what they're trying to do, because they're just like forcing this opinion on everyone and just like perpetuating the stigma about like what homelessness is and like what you need to do to be able to help. And like especially the sleep out one with like it's like this great idea that you can go and like sleep out in your backyard, but that's not at all the experience of people. And yeah, we thought it was really offensive.
And I mean, I think especially in terms of the sleep out, I think if there's no education piece happening, then so there's no, it's like, okay, so you have the sleep out, but I think it's important to also have that sort of education piece and explain why sleeping out is actually dangerous for certain populations, or for everyone, actually.
Go ahead. The white sweater in the front. That's the way to describe you.
We were kind of talking about that too, how they make it seem like, and you pointed it out with the posters, that they're just there smiling, and we said we noticed the exact same thing. It's not a party, and like, what are you really, how is that really helping anyone? How is that helping you as a participant in a sleep out to be educated, or helping the homeless youth in that community. Another thing that we talked about is, to the first point, there's this whole stereotype and generalization, and it's so unfair that these organizations or the government with all this money who have the power to put out these posters and these PSAs or whatever are really just forcing that one narrative, and you're really not getting the true side or the other side of the story. But more and more, I think there are, I don't want to say like citizen journalism pieces, but out there are like more and more videos of, what truly the narrative is. So, yeah, that's my comment.
I just want to add that I call them hot spots, kind of the emergency issues impacting homeless people. And about 10, 15 years ago, I added hate and discrimination as one of them, because so many people on the street were very obviously being harassed, violated, experiencing violence. And it really kind of followed the time that these images became more prominent, and prominent people such as the past mayor and chief of police would say horrible things about squeegee youth, et cetera, and it kind of fuels hate and anger towards people.
Oh, hi. I just wanted to say, like, one of my first thoughts about the images is, like, who they're aimed towards a certain group, and obviously, like, it is a strategy to try to, get money and also awareness, but a lot of times it's money. And I don't think that people, when they look at it necessarily, the people that it is aimed at, people, I don't know, like middle class, upper middle class organizations, really see anything different, because that's all the information that they get, and then they don't necessarily, I don't know, like I've even talked to somebody who said that like he's afraid to even like engage with people who come up to him, let alone really observe and look at what's going on around him downtown. So I think that maybe even though it is sort of like right in front of you, you don't know what it looks like except based on that kind of thing. So yeah, I mean, it doesn't really at all contribute to any kind of education. I think that it is perpetuating a narrative for the purposes of, the money that they need to get to keep the same kind of, I don't know, like the status quo for whatever agencies it is. And unless there is pressure, like around like homophobia or transphobia, LGBT youth that are suffering, and people like put pressure on them to go like, this is unacceptable and we can't support you unless you're going to address that. I mean, that has to start with like people actually being educated and having actual real images portrayed. And I don't think that any of that stuff, and we're like 90% of what's out there as the narrative, is at all considering what actual homeless people go through. And like, yeah, I don't even think they like think to ask people about it half the time. They just like go with what they think is what people want to hear and what they want to feel good about themselves. So yeah, that's it. That's why they're smiling. It's just like, yay, we're being helpful. We're gonna help people. That's it.
Thank you.
For the first couple of pictures, the ones about panhandling, I found them, like when I first viewed them, it was almost kind of confusing because it's showing these things that are supposed to, like the small print, people don't look at those things, especially for ads. Like you see the jarring images and you see the big print, and you'll just see like, oh, we shouldn't be giving money to these people, but people won't stop to read the small print and say, oh, I should be doing this. So these ads are more focused on the negativity rather than you should be doing this. They're saying you shouldn't be doing that. And that's not actually helping anything, because people, when they see images online or on the streets, they'll see the big print, they'll see the picture, and they'll say, this is a negative thing, I shouldn't be doing it. Instead of, oh, look at, make a donation underneath, they won't see that. So these ads, I don't find are very effective. Like if I were to see this, I wouldn't be like, what does that small website say? Where can I give money to? I would say, oh, I shouldn't be giving money to panhandlers, because that's all it's saying to me.
Yeah. That's a good point.
I think a big issue which myself and Maddie have seen is a lot of organizations in the city that do actual good, so they're at the grassroots level, they don't have money to create media like this. The organizations that do, they have the money, and I'm not going to name names, but we've been sort of involved with an organization that has a lot of money, it's well known and it's trusted. And it's involved with a lot of corporations, you know, and they're one of these organizations that, you know, every high-rise, you know, office building will be on board with their movements. And I think, like, they have a marketing department, and the fact that all this money goes into their marketing speaks to that. And, you know, we're speaking with someone who's in the marketing department, and we mentioned that, you know, we need some money to give importance cards to these people that talk to us. And the director of marketing was shocked. She didn't understand that someone who is NFA would want a Tim Hortons card for their time. And I think that speaks to what's happening here. It's organizations with marketing departments that have all this money for the, sort of like the glamour and the glitz, and, well, it's so misinformed.
Yeah, absolutely.
The other thing that's happening is, you're right, those organizations that don't have that kind of marketing department, and thank God they don't, because some of them actually might create more of this, but they also can't speak out about what's happening to their organizations, the funding cuts they've experienced, and these ads don't portray that reality. For example, that it's illegal, it's a criminal act for somebody to sleep on Nathan Phillips Square if they're homeless. That's new, relatively new, recent history. It doesn't tell the story that a city-funded agency can no longer give survival supplies when they do outreach to people that are homeless. That means sleeping bags, hot food, blankets in the city of Toronto. So it's not telling this other story, you know, of the bigger politics that are going on around public policy and homelessness. They can't speak out because they'll lose funding. It's a cloak of silence, silencing.
I just wanted, we were talking about sort of the images and the issues. I'm from Vancouver, and I work with community advocates in the downtown east side in Vancouver. And one of the things that the Carnegie Community Action Center has just finished this week is a welfare challenge, where they challenged people to live for a week on $21 a week, $3 a day. Because the welfare rates in BC haven't been raised for like 8 years. But because the action has been organized from the community in the downtown east side, it's actually been very effective. So when you talk about education, I mean, it's a really good example of it, because what's happened is that there's been a lot of media. All of the people who are doing it are blogging or saying, Jenny Kwan, for example, was doing it, but also people, you know, who are not sort of big names were also involved in the welfare challenge. And they've done it now for 3 or 4 years. And I think there is a way that kind of thing, not like this, but there is a way that kind of thing can work as an education. Yeah. Because people have to pay attention to the fact that if you're on welfare, you're living on $3 a day for food. You know?
Absolutely. And of course it makes such a big difference when the community is involved and community voices are involved.
Do folks want to maybe jump back to our presentations and some of the images and stories we were telling you to comment or ask questions about? Anything's wide open? Yes.
Thank you. Those are really interesting talks, and these images are. I've been thinking a lot about them. I kind of want to jump back on this comment that these two folks made at the about marketing departments and that organization they are involved with. I used to work for an organization very similar to, I think, the kind they're talking about. And these downtown Calgary ads remind me too of kind of this organization I used to work for. And reflecting upon my experience there and these images and the discussion we're having and the stories you've been telling me, it seems to me that a lot of the time organizations like this might mistake what they're doing, their marketing, for actual like policy and for actual change. And I feel like there's this, we can't substitute actual policy change and actual change in our communities for simply just putting images up on screen and for just simply marketing it out and telling people to change their behavior. I think that there's a slippage here that needs to be dealt with by these big, large organizations with lots of money. And I think, I don't know, that was kind of just the thought I had thinking about this. Not really a question or anything.
I think it's really important what you
Okay. Yeah, so Alex is telling me to tell you a story. So I wasn't at the vigil today because I was involved with some advocacy, and I don't know if the Ryerson journalism student is here. Oh, yay. So you're a star. Oh, my gosh. So, you know, last February, January, February, there were 4 homeless men, 3 of whom literally froze to death on the streets of Toronto in a short period of time. A 4th man died in the Peter Street Referral Center, which is where you go and you sit all night while you're waiting for the city workers to find you a shelter bed that is non-existent. So, you know, many years ago we had a collection of freezing deaths, and we went to an inquest and we got some good policy, but no housing out of it. And so here we are again with, you know, 3, 4 more deaths, very tragic. No, those are only the ones we know about. So this one man, and by the way, since I've been at Ryerson, there have been 3 homeless deaths literally on Ryerson campus since I've been here. I'm only starting my 3rd year here. One was in front of the Mattamy Athletic Center during the ice storm. Another was in O'Keefe Lane. A young man, who was not in a shelter, run over by a garbage truck. And a 3rd on campus was a man that froze to death in the Young Dundas bus shelter. So when that happened in February, it was like -16, -17, and the city had not called a cold weather alert, even though there'd been a death 2 days before. So that's another story. So we held a vigil there. We did a press conference. People brought flowers. That was in February. So last week I walked by, and if you're walking by Yonge and Dundas, look at that bus shelter. It is covered in ads of a very expensive coat and boot company called Pajab, or oh, you guys know, I'd never heard of Pajar. So, and big wording, big letters this big that said, "Share the warmth." And like, I went ballistic. I was so upset, and so one thing led to another. It led to phone calls to the city councillor, Kristen Wong-Tam. It led to contacting the TTC. It led to calling the company, Astral, that does the meet. Like a big bureaucracy exists around these corporate ads. And this Ryerson journalism student in the back is going to have a big scoop when this story goes to print. So thank you, because she worked on it and she got to people quicker and got answers quicker than I did. But the ultimate end of the day, I don't think you know, is that a deal was made that I think I'm going to have to live with, which is the wording, "Share the warmth," is removed. It's gone. But the images of the coats are all left. But what has since come out of it, and we're so starved for funding that I'm going to take this and run with it, is Astral and the city are going to work with me to create a public education campaign that will include decals that will be put on bus shelters all over the place to say who to call in the event of an emergency, because people don't know. People don't know that you don't have to call 911 if you're just like worried about somebody being cold or in extreme high temperatures as well. So it's 311 if you can get through, because I had trouble getting through today. And so that's just an example of a current activism component that helped, and it was definitely, Oh, you name dropped me. Well, I name dropped you too, because once organizations know that the media are onto this, and this was not the Toronto Star, right? I mean, but I'm trying to get them on it too. This was Ryerson. You know, there's the Ryersonian and the Eye Opener, and she's a journalism student. That you actually made a massive difference, and I don't think that'll ever be allowed to happen again. They admitted their insensitivity, and we didn't get the whole ads removed, but we got something. So that's what happened. Yes.
Sorry, I already have the mic.
You got it.
Maybe, Alex, you could talk about this really briefly in your presentation. You talked about after Teal's story, the Covenant House, they changed some of their policies. Could you just maybe elaborate a little bit on that in the specifics?
For sure. So, how am I going to say this? I have to be careful what I say.
Well, so first of all, I would say that today, Covenant House is very different, obviously, than it was when Teal stayed at Covenant House. So now they have, they've changed their intake forms. So that's. When was that? I think that, well, the video we made in 2012, but she had stayed there maybe a couple of years before, something like that. And so they've updated their intake forms, for example. So that's something I didn't really speak about in my presentation, but intake forms are, there's a formal intake process when a young person enters a shelter where they're asked questions and forms need to be filled out. And oftentimes the staff member will just sit down with the youth and will just fill out the forms themselves. And oftentimes these forms only have the option for you to identify as male or female. So you can't identify as anything else. And if you identify other than male or female, then that's not actually included in the forms. And so you're made to be invisible, right? So that's how institutional erasure works. That's one of the ways it works in the shelter system. And so Covenant House has updated their forms so that now young people can identify in many different ways. And it's not just, male, female, or other, but they actually have a whole list of different categories. And I think that I think that there's much more of an understanding that it's not the staff member who decides for the young person. So that up until now, I think it still happens where they're going through the intake and the staff member will just look at the young person and however they perceive that young person to identify, they'll just check it off. Whereas now it's more of like, it's more of a conversation that you have. So that's a very big way that they've changed. And also taking part, I spoke a little bit about the working group that the city, we had formed a LGBTQ working group that looks at homelessness and different issues. And so Covenant House was part of that working group as well. They have I think it's on Tuesdays. Every Tuesday they have a queer and trans youth homelessness program. So it's not like it's an evening, which is similar to something that SOY, Supporting Our Youth, they have a Monday night drop-in. So it's really great to see that Covenant House now has an LGBTQ program within their service. So those are some of the major ways I think that they've changed, and also just that there's so much more of an understanding. There's no longer a resistance, and there's more training happening. So I know that they're working together with the 519 to bring in trainers from the 519 to do LGBTQ cultural competency training. So I think that's very major, and that's a lot more than a lot of the other youth shelters in the city. Yeah.
Well, the mic's going back there. I wanted to ask you, you referred to the new LGBTQ facility that's opening as transitional housing.
Yeah.
Can you explain how it's not a shelter?
Yeah,
yeah.
sure.
Thanks.
So I think in Canada, we have really spent a lot of focus on the emergency response, right? So when we look at the emergency response, this includes emergency shelters, so like more of a crisis response. If somebody is just been kicked out of the house and they need somewhere to sleep immediately, so they can go into the emergency shelter system. But with a transitional housing program, you can stay for longer. So it's more of like an independent style living, I guess you could say. So normally a young person will be already at a shelter, and then they have to put the application through. And it takes a long time, obviously, to get into these programs. So we still don't have an emergency shelter in Canada for LGBT youth, and it's something that we absolutely need.
I have to correct my speaking about it. Thanks, that's helpful.
Yeah, I think a lot of people
Yeah.
think that it is a shelter,
Yeah,
but it's not. It's something very different.
So Alex, you were talking about in your research developing relationships with your key stakeholders and making sure that they knew that you wanted to work with them.
Yeah.
But we've also been talking a lot about challenging systems and organizations and corporations and the way they do work in relation to these issues. So as activist researchers, how much should we seek to work with and within the systems that already exist? And how much should we seek to challenge them and subvert them? And is there a balance we can strike there?
Yeah, I think a balance is very important, because I think for myself, when I first started, it was very much coming from a really strong sort of activist point where I was like, I'm just against the system. I don't want to be part of it. I just, want to take it down and do whatever I can. And then I was like, wait, why don't they want to work with me? Why don't they want to talk to me? So I think, within that, I learned an important lesson that it's like, in order for them to change, if I'm making all these recommendations, they're not going to implement these changes unless I find a way to collaborate with them, right? And so that didn't mean that I wanted to necessarily work at the different organizations that I was trying to work with. You know, I didn't want to work at the organizations. I just wanted to find a way to work with them. So I think one of the ways that I did this was, for example, the City of Toronto, with their different committees, they have committee meetings that are open to the public. And so you could sign up and you can depute and you have 5 minutes to speak. And so I would start to attend these meetings because I thought if I'm not going to be invited to a meeting, then I'm just going to invite myself and I'll just show up at these meetings and I'll say what I have to say for 5 minutes. And Teal came with me and shared her experience. And I think that actually was that was a turning point for them because they started to notice that I was actually taking the time to attend these meetings and share important insights. And then eventually they decided to, we met and we formulated this working group. So I think a balance is really important. I don't think it could be one extreme or the other. And I think it's also, I think it's about making sure that they understand that, like I said, that you're not working against them, but you're trying to work together with them with a little bit of distance, if that makes sense.
Hi there. Oh, shit. Sorry. Okay, hi. My name is Al. I have a ton of questions to ask you, Cathy, but that's like later. I got a question for you, Alex.
Yeah.
So, the queer and trans community in Toronto is so small. Like, I'm pretty sure I've met Teal like once or twice in a program. But like, it's so small, but like, I feel like there's less solidarity for any homeless causes or anything involving like being street involved. So and like Pride is so corporate now,
Yeah.
So how can queer and trans communities as well as Pride sponsors or anything involving LGBTQ2SA organizing help be better allies and be better in solidarity with homeless LGBTQ peoples?
Yeah, I mean, that's a complicated question. I feel like that's something I really struggled with, where when I first started doing this work almost 10 years ago, I thought, like, what's up with the, the queer and trans communities? Like, how come nobody's talking about this issue? It's one thing that maybe the shelters and government aren't talking about it, but why isn't the LGBT community coming together to actually fight against this issue? So that's something that I've really struggled with a lot over the years and something that I'm still trying to understand, actually. So I may not have like a very clear answer for you, but for myself, I don't know. It's been really about, just as I said, trying to build rapport with the community and trying to attend different youth programs. And so, I mean, I was coming from a place where I was the researcher coming to these youth programs, trying to build rapport and build trust with the young people, but at the same time also working with the organizers of the programs, who a lot of them were queer and trans, and just trying to also raise awareness and educate. And so I think I've been talking a lot about raising awareness and educating the public, right? But I think it also had to start with raising awareness and educating the community with which I belong to, and which the young people belong to as well. Yeah.
Hi. So I'm absolutely aghast that there is no LGBTQ emergency shelter. I did not know that, and I am a little shocked by that. What can we do to actually get that first shelter? What still needs to happen? How can we push that along?
Yeah. So I do want to just say, okay, so there's no emergency shelter, right? But there is the transitional housing program. There's going to be 2 that are going to open up in Toronto. And then there is a host homes program that opened up in Calgary. And this is essentially, it's not a shelter, it's not a transitional housing, but it's working with families in different communities who might have an extra room in their home that are willing to house a young person experiencing homelessness, right? So they work together, the organization works with the different families, they provide them with some financial support and some training. So there's that type of program, and then there's like a Housing First program in Vancouver. So we're starting to slowly see different types of housing programs, but we still haven't seen, right, like the emergency shelter. And this is something that, I mean, I've been advocating for this for a very long time, and so many people in the community have been fighting for this. And so there's no plans, especially, it's really difficult because we're at a time right now where in Canada, we're moving away from the emergency response. So they're putting less and less money into the creation of shelters and more money into Housing First programs, right? And into transitional housing. So it's very hard to fight for more emergency shelter beds when they're not putting any money and any funding into emergency shelter beds. Right? So, I mean, it's complicated.
Yeah, so all the more reason to do it because
Yes.
it saves lives. So I would think that in the coming year, just the stats, the occupancy that we learn about the new transitional LGBTQ site and figuring out who are the advocate groups that you can trust to mobilize and work on the issue. Because if it happens in Toronto, then it'll happen across the country. Because we probably will be first. So because we've gotten this one win. So I think it's strategizing and we cannot let any more shelters be closed. Like that is the mentality. And the Housing First model is allowing cities to use that as an excuse to close shelters. And usually they're women and children's shelters because we don't have LGBTQ shelters to shut. But it's happened in Ottawa and it's happened in Kingston. So I think it's great question because you've just nailed what has to happen.
Yeah, and I do want to add just one more thing, is that I recently attended a conference in Montreal. It was the Canadian Conference on Ending Homelessness. Canadian Alliance to End Homelessness happens every year. And so there was a presentation by the City of Toronto, and they did speak about, I can't remember exactly how many, but they did say that they will be opening up a number of new emergency shelters, actually, even though they're shutting down shelters, there are going to be a number that will be opened up. And I did ask how many of those will be youth shelters, but none of them are going to be youth shelters. And so I think that in this time, I think it'd be really important to, as activists and advocates, to show up to these meetings that are held at the City of Toronto, and to really to speak about why we need these shelters. I think this is probably a very good time to do that as they work towards opening up the shelters.
Thank you so much, Alex and Cathy, for informing us on so many complex issues around poverty and homelessness, and particularly about the struggle for representation. I also feel like I learned some new terms like knowledge translation, and the notion of the embedded artist is something that will really stay with me. Thank you again, and please join us in 2 weeks for our final lecture in the series with Deanna Bowen. Stay warm and stay dry, and see you next time. Thank you so much.